So we've made it to week 12 in my series Journey to Marvel's Infinity War. Each week in 2018, I'm going to re-review one movie in the MCU in release order leading up to Avengers Infinity War. Today we have made it to Ant-Man, the end of Phase 2 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Some people think that this one's the start of Phase 3. Technically, it's the end of Phase 2. Civil War kicks off Phase 3. Here's how this works. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the background of the movie, and this one it's interesting because all the Edgar Wright stuff. Then I'm going to review the movie, talk about the good, the mixed stuff, and the bad stuff. I'm going to talk about the MCU kind of connections in there, how it ties into other films, and then I'm going to share some of you guys' takes on the movie using the Stardust app. So before I get started, tell me down below in the comment section, what did you think about Ant-Man? Were you angry about all this stuff with Edgar Wright? Give me your context. Let's have a nice, fun, lively discussion, and let's get started. In the late 1980s, Stan Lee approached New World Pictures about developing an Ant-Man film, but due to the development of Disney's Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, the film gained no traction. In the early zeros, Howard Stern attempted to purchase the rights to the character, but Artisan eventually made a deal with Marvel to produce the film. In 2003, Edgar Wright and Joe Cornish wrote a treatment for the film for Artisan and eventually pitched this idea of the film to Kevin Feige. In 2006, Wright was hired to direct the film. From 2006 to 2011, Wright and Cornish wrote 3 different drafts of the script. Since Ant-Man wasn't as a high profile of a character, the film wasn't a high priority. Likewise, Wright's ideas for Ant-Man's origins didn't fit in the Avengers timeline. In 2012, Wright spent a week shooting test footage for the project, which was shown at San Diego Comic-Con 2012. The following year, Kevin Feige observed that the script needed to be revised to fit the current MCU as the film had been in development since before the first Iron Man. 6 months later, Wright and Cornish turned in a 4th draft of the script. Over the next 9 months, most of the main cast was hired, including Paul Rudd and Michael Douglas. By March 2015, Wright turned in a 5th draft of the script. But only 2 months later, Wright and Marvel jointly announced he was leaving the project over differences in their visions for the film. Wright noted they wanted to do a draft of the script without him and said, suddenly becoming a director for hire on it, you're sort of less emotionally invested and start to wonder why you're there, really. Soon afterwards, Peyton Reed was hired to direct and Adam McKay was hired to rewrite the script with Paul Rudd. Filming began less than 6 months after Wright's departure. The film was another success for Marvel Studios. It currently holds an 82% on Rotten Tomatoes and went on to gross $519 million worldwide. While still profitable, the film was the lowest grossing film of Phase 2 of the MCU. Edgar Wright still hasn't seen Ant-Man, but he did watch Captain America: Civil War, and afterwards he had this to say to Paul Rudd. You know, I haven't seen the movie, and I will never watch it. I did see you in Civil War, and you were the funniest bit. Speaking on what happened with his departure, he simply stated, I wanted to make a Marvel movie, but I don't think they wanted to make an Edgar Wright movie. So there's a little background on where the movie came from. The departure of Edgar Wright really burned a lot of people to this movie. Even in some of the Stardust reactions, that was a key thing that was brought up.
Ant-Man serves as a very underwhelming end to Marvel's Phase 2. That doesn't really mean it's bad, and it makes you wonder what this movie would have been like if Edgar Wright did it.
I've been a fan of the MCU since the beginning, but this is the first movie I chose not to see in the theater, and that had a lot to do with my frustration about Edgar Wright's exit as director.
Just so you know, that guy at the end, he's actually one of my lifelong friends. He's one of the guys that I go to the movies with on Thursday night, so it was fun that he shared a Stardust reaction so he could appear in this video. With that said, let's get started talking about the good. For me, the best thing about this movie was the cast. Once again, Marvel has just knocked it out of the park with the casting, and what they managed to do a great job is they get a variety of different types of actors, whether you're talking about a legacy actor like Michael Douglas or Paul Rudd, who's kind of an A-lister that you would never think about him for a role like this, or a television actress like Evangeline Lilly. It's sprinkled with all these different actors that are familiar faces that work so well together. So let's kind of walk through each one of these. You get Paul Rudd in this role, and what they've done a great job with the Marvel Universe is casting actors that you respect them for what they've done before, but you don't see them in these types of roles. So whether it was Robert Downey Jr., whether that was Chris Evans, or then Paul Rudd in this movie, it's not like they were cast to type, but once you see them in that role, they seem so perfect. And when you get Scott Lang as this kind of computer programmer turned petty criminal turned superhero, it makes sense that you'd have this Paul Rudd type personality for this movie. And you watch it and you go, yeah, that's perfect. I don't know who else I would get in this role. Like so many of these other casting jobs in the MCU with these leads, where you go, I don't know who would have been better at this. They've done an amazing job. From him, let's move over to Michael Douglas, and he's one of these classic actors that every time he's on screen, it just brings a sense of legitimacy to whatever you're watching. He just raises the gravitas of the entire film, and he even does a good job with the humor. Like, you wouldn't think Michael Douglas would be one of the funny guys in the movie, but because he's playing off someone like Paul Rudd and there's all these really nice setups, he gets a bunch of really funny lines throughout the film. And speaking of putting Michael Douglas in the movie, that opening scene has him with the de-aging. I think it works. I look at that scene and I know that I'm looking at a special effect, but at the same time, it's a really good special effect that I don't think I would know I was looking at a special effect if I didn't know Michael Douglas hasn't looked like that since the time period in that movie when that happened. And so, I think that absolutely works inside this movie. Evangeline Lilly, I don't think they give her as many moments to really shine, but what she's given for the role, she does a good job with it, and does a definitely good enough job that you're like, I'm very pumped to see what they're going to do with Ant-Man and the Wasp. Very excited about her role in that film and how that's all going to play out. And then you've got like Michael Pena in a side role, but he steals every scene that he's in doing the storytelling or like, back it up type stuff that he does in the movie. He's so funny. Speaking of funny, this movie is very funny, and in certain ways it's very typical MCU humor, and in other ways it's very distinct and has its own vibe to the way it does humor. For example, the Michael Pena stuff, really funny, not like anything else we've seen in the MCU. Paul Rudd has a very specific way that he does dialogue and kind of like little quips and things like that. And when you pair him with Michael Douglas being the straight man next to him, kind of making quips with it, it works really nice and gives it a different flavor to the humor in the movie. And it's pretty obvious why this movie is really funny and has a distinct flavor to the humor. The first 5 drafts were written by Edgar Wright and his writing partner. Then it was rewritten by Adam McKay and Paul Rudd, and improvised, I'm sure, by Paul Rudd on the set, in which case you get a very distinct sense of humor in that. Also, this movie has a very unique visual style to it. Specifically, when they do the shrinking effects, they do a great job with that. And they do this very deep depth of field thing where the background is very out of focus other than where Ant-Man's at, and it looks very cool. This is one of the few movies I did see in 3D, and it was cool. Normally, I'm not a big fan of 3D. This one did some cool stuff, so gotta give credit where credit's due. This one does the 3D gimmick in a cool, fun way. And a lot of that, my understanding is it goes back to what Edgar Wright had been working on. They've put the test footage out there. Some people have seen it. And it's very much reminiscent of what Edgar Wright had been working on. And in the movie, it always looks very cool. And they're also very clever in the way they decided to use the shrinking effect, whether you talk about the Thomas the Train fight, little things where things can expand, and all sorts of fun humor in that, fun action in that, and cleverness in the writing and the execution of these ideas. One of the things I loved about this movie is that it just expanded the realm of the MCU and our understanding of S.H.I.E.L.D. simply by having that opening sequence with Hank Pym talking to the S.H.I.E.L.D. guys, and then the little quips that he makes throughout the movie talking about Starks and things like that. It just makes it have this sense of a history for all these movies, and you're watching it going, oh, how I desperately wish that there was some way that we could get that Michael Douglas, Hank Pym, Ant-Man movie. That would be incredible. Maybe 5 years in the future, we'll get some technology and they can pull that off. That would be an amazing, amazing movie. Maybe we'll get a scene like that in Ant-Man and the Wasp. I would just lose it if we get Hank Pym Ant-Man with, I believe, Michelle Pfeiffer is playing Evangeline Lilly's mother in it. I would lose it. That would be amazing. But there's little details that just expand the universe. Sorry, I went a little bit of rabbit trail there. Lastly, one of the things that makes this movie really work is that it finds its own unique, distinct place in the MCU by being a heist movie. It's intentionally a smaller story with smaller stakes. If you look at a lot of the previous movies in Phase 2, you're talking about Ultron trying to kill all of mankind and the Avengers having to stop him. You're talking about the Guardians of the Galaxy having to guard the galaxy. You're talking about Thor trying to stop the ether from destroying the earth and Asgard from being torn to pieces. They're so epic in nature. Even Iron Man 3 is about stopping global terrorism. And then this movie, it's all about trying to stop technology from getting into the wrong hands. And that makes it unique and distinct. It's not a movie that's trying to hit a home run. Age of Ultron was trying to hit a home run, and it didn't. It hit like a double. And so it felt a little disappointing when you watch Age of Ultron. This movie was trying to hit a double, and it hit a double. Even if you look at the budget of this movie, it's one of the lowest budgeted movies in the MCU, certainly of Phase 2. It's because they knew they were making a smaller movie, and that's okay. And in doing so, it's distinct in its feel. They found its niche, its little corner to tell a fun story where you can do different types of things, and it's just kind of works out nicely that the guy that shrinks down small has the smallest scale story, and it works really nicely. From there, let's move on to the mixed aspects of the film, and the big one that comes to mind is the main villain, Yellow Jacket. Now, when it comes to the story that they're telling about trying to get technology out of the wrong hands, this type of villain makes sense. He's an evil guy that's greedy, rich, and will do anything to gain more money and power. So that makes sense that you'd have this type of villain. Corey Stoll is also a great actor, and so putting him in this role, he fits nicely into it. And being that he has the mirror technology, it sets up some great little sequences in the third act of the movie that are tons of fun. That sequence when they're fighting on the Thomas the Tank Engine. I said Thomas the Train in a previous video, and people in the comment section called me out on that. Having that battle sequence on there, that's great. I mean, I loved that sequence. At the same time, the character feels very much like a stock Marvel villain. Very reminiscent of Obadiah Stane in Iron Man 1 as the guy that's been running the company since the previous generation stopped running it. And once the technology, they weren't given information about it. All of it very, very reminiscent of Iron Man. Now, if you're going to rip off a movie, the original Iron Man, that's a great one to rip off. But it makes the character very derivative, and thus he feels just very kind of stale and forgettable. And if Iron Man 1 didn't exist, some of those complaints go away because the villain fits the story here. And in some ways, I think he's established a little bit better than Obadiah Stane was, where Stane, it felt really sudden that he turns into a sociopath that jumps in a metal suit and starts killing people. It felt like it was a little bit more earned in this movie, and things were going down that would provoke him to putting on the suit to go into action, where that wasn't really the case in Iron Man 1. So all in all, he feels like a very mixed villain, because in the context of just the movie, it works. In the context of the greater MCU, he feels derivative and a little bit forgettable and stale. From there, let's move on to the bad. And I don't actually have any big issues with this movie. It's just a movie that some of those positives that I mentioned before about it's only trying to be a double, it does not going for the big stakes. It feels really safe. It feels like they'd figured out the Marvel formula and the right number of quips, the right way of like, let's give it just enough flavor so it's a heist movie, and we know how to get this legacy actor, and we know how to get kind of this A-lister that's known for something else, but we'll put Paul Rudd in there. And it's like they just knew the template, and they even took the formula of Iron Man 1 and just crunched it through the Marvel machine. And so on the other end of it, you get a very enjoyable movie that just, it doesn't pop. It doesn't feel like it took any risks, where you can look at what they did with Age of Ultron and say a lot of things in that movie didn't work, but it was very ambitious. They were trying for something and they just didn't quite achieve it. Or you think Thor Ragnarok more recently, this movie that was so weird, quirky, bizarre, and the end result is this really fun movie that's so distinct and has such a strong, distinct flavor to it. This movie on the whole doesn't have that strong flavor to it. The humor has a flavor to it. The visuals have a flavor to it. The heist genre, but the package as a whole, individual elements, distinct. The package as a whole feels like a stock Marvel movie. So that's where for a lot of people, they'll say this one's the boring one. One's kind of forgettable. You don't need to see this one. And I can't say that they're fully wrong. I can understand where they're coming from. If there's a movie that you're going to feel like you're like overdone on Marvel movies, and so you just don't care about them anymore, I could see where this would be the one where you just kind of dump a lot of your hate onto it because it's just kind of there. Another issue with this movie is it takes a little while to get going. The first 20 minutes seem a little bit clunky as we're trying to get to the Ant-Man stuff, and then there's like 45 minutes of training to be Ant-Man, and then we have a very long third act once we get into heist mode and then final battle mode, all that fun stuff. But that first real hour of the movie takes a little while to get going to the stuff that we really want to see. Even when we talk about it as a heist movie, it doesn't get there for quite a while, and the movie relies heavily on the humor for that reason. But overall, this is a movie that I thoroughly enjoy, that I find very rewatchable, and it gets overlooked for the reasons I mentioned in the negative of feeling familiar and stale. But I don't think they're actually legitimate complaints about the movie, because there's so much good in here in all the aspects of it, visually, the humor, the casting, the genre of it. So I thoroughly enjoy this one. I would give this, I'd go with a B+ on this one and an 8.5 on the entertainment level. It's a very solid movie. And I stated as a negative that can feel stale because it's just going through that Marvel template. It's a really good template. The Disney machine and all their stuff, it's really good. They're very good at making blockbusters and solid entertainment, and this is another piece of solid entertainment from Disney and Marvel Studios that I thoroughly enjoy. And I get confused when people say they don't like this one or they're bored by it. I'm not really sure what they're like. I don't get it. If you're that person, let me know down below how you're bored by this movie or hate it. I don't know what's hate. Paul Rudd's so likable. Michael Douglas, such a cool guy. Evangeline Lilly, solid actress. Michael Pena, so funny. How do you hate this one? Anyway, with that said, let's move on to the MCU connections. And this one doesn't have as many deep cuts, especially like Age of Ultron. There were so many deep cuts on that one. This one's a little bit more straightforward. So right out of the gate, we get Hank Pym meeting up with S.H.I.E.L.D. people. So we get this whole history. Agent Carter's in the mix. And we get to see her come back and what she looked like when she was 60 years old. I believe she's 60 years or 70 years old. I believe she would have been at that point in time that that movie took place. So a bunch of cool stuff like that in that introduction and that history that we get throughout Michael Douglas talking about his connections to the Starks and his dislike for the Starks and not wanting them to get his technology. And then leading into little lines of dialogue in there where he's like, no, we're not going to call the Avengers. We're not going to do that. Starks are not going to get a hold of my technology. But Scott Lang isn't as concerned about some of those things. So he decides to go and do some investigating of his own, goes to the new S.H.I.E.L.D. base that we saw established at the end of Age of Ultron, has a little encounter with Falcon. And I'm wondering if this is one of those sequences that Edgar Wright didn't want to put in. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if there's been some quotes out there, but it seems like this could be where they tried to force in some Avengers connections to set up Civil War, which we see then, I guess I even mentioned that, in the post-credit sequence. One of the setups is that Falcon says to Steve Rogers, I know a guy, and that's a connection to Civil War for Ant-Man. And I don't know if that's what Edgar Wright, some of his issues were, some of those types of things. Anyway, throughout the movie, at the end of it, when we're doing our final Michael Pena, like, let's tell a story deal, there's references to a guy slinging webs in New York City. Spider-Man, who once again shows up in Civil War. The first post-credit scene that's before the one I mentioned just a second ago, you have Michael Douglas taking Evangeline Lilly, and he goes, here's the Wasp costume, setting up Ant-Man and the Wasp, knowing that we're going to get both of them together. So those are the ones that I noticed in this one. I wasn't taking as close of notes on this one because there aren't as many, in which case I might have forgotten some really obvious big ones. So tell me down in the comment section, which big MCU connections did I miss? If you catch one that's important that I missed, I will pin that so it's up at the top so everyone can see the silly stuff that I missed out. With that said, I'm going to share some of you guys' takes on the movie over from the Stardust app.
Ant-Man serves as a very underwhelming end to Marvel's Phase 2. That doesn't really mean it's bad,
but I did find the special effects and the characters and the action really fun.
Fantastically funny film, and although it doesn't focus on as much on action as it does comedy.
Now, having just rewatched all of the Marvel movies, I've got to say this movie was way more entertaining than I gave it credit for.
This was kind of like a Saturday morning cartoon movie in a way.
Ant-Man was a great movie. We got a heist movie in the MCU.
The end fight sequence with the trains, that's one of the best scenes in the film.
I think the comedy in it fits perfectly with the action sequences, as well, like, for example, the toy train fight. That's perfect. It's funny, but it's also a good fight.
It's not one of the worst ones, but it's not one of the better ones. It's just right in the middle.
Fun movie. It was really funny. It was really action-packed, and I enjoyed it.
Now, it's not without its flaws, though. The villain kind of sucks, but other than that, I don't have a ton of complaints about the movie.
It's just, for me, the villain. I just didn't find him that compelling.
We had an iffy villain.
The villain's a little bit generic, but it's Marvel. What do you expect? Yeah, so this movie is pretty good. One of my favorites. It's just great character moments.
Ant-Man is a pretty decent film. I don't think it lives up to some of the other greats of Marvel.
I believe Marvel has done excellent work in casting their main heroes, and in Ant-Man, Paul Rudd is no exception. And they have excellent supporting choices. Michael Douglas, Michael Peña.
This movie was fun on every level that it was meant to be fun. I think it's a great addition to the MCU.
So there you have it. That's what you guys had to say about Ant-Man. If you want to appear in a future video, it's really simple. All you have to do is download the Stardust app for your smartphone. You can get it at the link down below in the description. Once you download the app, totally free, no ads or anything like that, follow my account first. That kind of helps me out a little bit with some stuff with Stardust. They like to reward things like that. Follow me first and then record your reactions to the movies. It's super simple. Right there in the app, you just select the movie, hit record right there. You don't need anything fancy. And then once you've recorded your reaction, tag me in it. Just there's a little symbol up in the right-hand corner. Click it, write my name in there. Nice, simple. If you want to appear in a future video, I'll include almost all of them so long as I can kind of see your face, what's kind of going on, and I can hear you. I can't include all of them because some of them people are real quiet like that, and I can't include that, or if there's noise in the background. So talk loud, nice and clear, and have something nice to say. I'd love to include you in a future video. And if you're new to my channel, please consider clicking that subscribe button. I do movie reviews, TV reviews, ranking videos. Key thing is, I don't want to just talk about movies, I want to talk about movies with you. So join me down in the comments section. Let's have a lively discussion. And as always, thank you for watching.